Japan economic development history is one that has gone through two cycles of succession. The Meiji era from 1868 to 1912 resulted in significant economic and societal change and allowed Japan to transition from agriculture to manufacturing by the 1920s. From the 1950s to the early 1980s, Japan transitioned from manufacturing to an industrialized economy in what is known as the Japanese miracle. The economy then matured between the late 1970s to early 1980s. Before 1868, the Japanese economy was predominantly agrarian with rice cultivation comprising the largest amount of agricultural production. In the lead-up to the 1900s, 65% of the labor market was employed in agriculture, which contributed 38% to GDP. During the Meiji Restoration period that started in 1868, Japan adopted a Western-based educational system. By 1871, Japan centralized all individual states into modern-day Japan after a turbulent period when individual states acted independently while the country was on constant besiege from European countries that wanted to colonize Japan. Policies adopted after Japan centralized in 1871 included mandates to focus on public education, social mobility, and the modernization of the army to defend against colonizers. As the restoration policies in 1871 began to be implemented into the economy, the country began to send students to study abroad in the United States and Europe to accelerate human capital development. At the same time, it hired around 3,000 Westerners to teach Japanese citizens modern science, mathematics, technology and foreign languages. This set Japan in relative equal ground to Western economies and accelerated economic growth. As Japan began to move away from agriculture, the mining and textile industry began to form in the 1870s, which were followed by heavy industries of machinery, metal, oil, and chemicals. When Japan modernized its army, the country began to engage in colonialism in 1895 until 1945 at the end of World War II. During Japan engagement in colonialism, Japan colonized Taiwan, Korea, Manchuria and parts of northern China. Japan's objective was to extract raw materials and to prevent other countries from restricting Japan access to sea lanes. As Japan continued to move away from agriculture, mining would eventually grow to contribute 23% to GDP, and by the late 1920s, agricultural reliance had decreased to 21% of GDP. The 1920s were transformational for Japan. Development in transportation and communication allowed the country to undergo speedy industrial development. Furthermore, the policies adopted through the Restoration Mandate in the 1870s and the large investments in human capital accelerated economic growth. Additionally, the government started to build new roads and improve existing ones, which gave Japan the infrastructure needed for the private sector to flourish. To incentivize the economy further during the 1920s, the Japanese government built factories and shipyards that were later sold to entrepreneurs at a fraction of the cost. The government also implemented policies of low taxes for corporations so that earnings could be reinvested in the economy. Over time, these corporations grew to become large conglomerates such as Mitsubishi that remain dominant domestically and internationally in the 21st century. Japan is home to some of the oldest business in the world, with some businesses lasting more than 100 years. As the country entered the 1930s, manufacturing and mining grew to 30% of GDP. In the 1930s, Japan shifted manufacturing production toward military support. World War I ended in 1918, and World War II was about to begin in 1939. The shift in the economy toward military production was a response to the hostile environment after World War I. By the end of World War II in 1945, Japan lost its colonies and its infrastructure was destroyed. This marked the end of Japan's first cycle of economic development. With Japan infrastructure destroyed at the end of World War II in 1945, economic production reverted to levels close to the 1900s. Nonetheless, the large devastation of the country after World War II served to motivate citizens to take action to revitalize Japan to pre-war levels. As Japanese began to work toward rebuilding Japan after World War II, a new cycle of economic development started anew in the 1950s in what is known as the Japanese miracle. Japan's focus after World War II was to rebuild the lost industrial capacity. The government allocated large investments into electric power, coal, iron and chemical fertilizers. By the 1950s, production levels were back to pre-war levels. What separated Japan from other countries after World War II was that Japan quickly equipped new factories with modern machines while World War II victors retained old factories. Additionally, the Japanese soldiers that came out of World War II integrated into a labor market that was well-educated and well-disciplined. The Japanese population after World War II had one of the highest literacy rates and one of the highest education standards. Furthermore, farmers left the countryside and joined modern industries. This allowed Japan to quickly rebuild. By 1965, the Japanese economy had diversified, and GDP was growing at around 9%. Manufacturing and mining began to expand at 13%, construction by 11%, infrastructure by 12%. These industries would eventually employ 41% of the population while agriculture shrank to 16%. In the late 1960s, the country opened to international competition, and this led to the development of the chemical manufacturing industry. By the 1970s, the economy was growing on average of 8% while new industries developed including retail trade, real estate, information and other services. The 1970s brought many surprises including an oil crisis in 1973. The oil crisis led Japan to alter the country's industrial structure. Resources were allocated to make industries less dependent on foreign energy like petroleum. This led to technological advances in microcircuitry and semiconductors which led to new industries in consumer electronics and computers. Furthermore, energy-efficient industries continued to expand, and the knowledge-based industry was established. Toward the end of the 1970s and early 1980s, the economy matured. GDP began to decrease and the last 20 years leading up to 2024, GDP has on average remained around 2%. As the economy was reaching maturity stage in the 1980s, Japan began to allocate around 20% of gross national product into investments of capital equipment. Many private companies followed the Japanese government and invested large sums into research and development. The result was that many Japanese firms gained popularity domestically and internationally because of their contribution to innovation and creativity. The decrease of interest rates since the 1970s had the side effect of creating a debt market event in the 1990s similar to the 2007 recession in the United States where real estate prices led to a bubble in what is now known as Japan's lost decade. The difference was that private debt only grew into the 60% when an economic contraction was triggered when the BOJ started to increase interest rates. Since the 1970s to the 1980s, the Japanese economy experienced continuous rise in unemployment. As a result, the Bank of Japan continuously decreased interest rates to stimulate economic growth. Since the 1990s, Japan has maintained low interest rates to stimulate economic growth, but it has had poor results. Innovation in the country is low and discrimination against women in the labor market is common. In 2024, women undergraduate students represented 46% of university students. Even though the number of women with university degrees is high, many women have a hard time finding a job at a well-established company, and the probability of promotions for women within these companies are low. For a country with stagnant economic growth, discrimination against women, who make up 46% of university students, leads to a serious dent of the labor market.